Imagine the soundtrack of a military field kitchen in the heart of World War II's most brutal conflict, the Eastern Front, not the crack of rifles or the thunder of artillery, but the dull clang of a ladle against a giant stew pot, the hiss of steam from boiling water, the rhythmic chop of onions on a worn wooden board. This was the domain of Ivan, a man whose hands were more accustomed to the weight of a potato sack than the heft of a rifle, his uniform perpetually stained with gravy and soot marked him not as a warrior but as a sustainer of warriors to the battle-hardened soldiers of the Red Army's 112th Rifle Division. He was simply Povar Ivan the cook, a figure of comfort, a bearer of hot soup that momentarily chased away the bone-deep chill of the Russian winter and the relentless fear of the German onslaught. On one apocalyptic morning in the summer of 1941, near the strategic town of Lugansk, that familiar symphony was shattered. The air, once filled with the scent of rough bread and gruel, was suddenly torn by a sound that froze the blood, the metallic growl of diesel engines and the screech of tank tracks. Through the morning mist, a line of hulking shapes emerged, Panzer III's and IVs of the advancing Wehrmacht, their guns sweeping the hastily prepared Soviet defenses. The soldiers, caught off guard, scrambled for their anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails, but the line wavered under the overwhelming force. In that chaos, Ivan stood by his field kitchen, a mobile potbelly stove on wheels, watching the pillars of his world collapse. His comrades, the men he fed, were being cut down. The field hospital tent was already overflowing. The roar of the tanks was deafening, a physical pressure against the chest. This was not his fight, his weapon was the spoon. Yet as he saw a German tank crush a foxhole where just an hour before he had served 2 young soldiers their rations, something fundamental shifted within him. A deep resonant fury, colder than the winter and hotter than his stove, ignited in his gut. He was just a cook, but on this day the cook would lay aside his ladle and perform a feat of such insane bravery that it would etch his name not in cookbooks but in the annals of military legend. This is the story of how Ivan Pavlovich Sereda traded his soup kettle for a hunter's instinct and against all odds stopped an armored column in its tracks. To the unlikely hero portrait of Ivan Pavlovich Sereda. Who was the man behind the apron? Ivan Pavlovich Sereda was not carved from the classic image of a Soviet hero. He was not a broad-shouldered, square-jawed political commissar from propaganda posters. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary young man from a farming family in Ukraine, drafted into the Red Army. His skills were immediately identified not on the rifle range but in the kitchen. He had a peasant's practical ingenuity and a quiet, observant nature. In the rigid hierarchy of the army, cooks occupied a unique, almost sacred space. They were non-combatants, but their role was paramount for morale. A hot meal was a tangible piece of home, a shred of normalcy in the abyss of war. Ivan took pride in this. He could turn meager rations of kasha, buckwheat porridge, canned tashanka, stewed meat, and whatever root vegetables could be scrounged into something that tasted like sustenance and care. He knew the soldiers by face, remembered who liked extra salt, who was from his home region. He was a listener, absorbing their fears and hopes with a silent nod as he served. Psychologically, he was the antithesis of the frontline assault trooper. His purpose was to nourish and preserve life, not to take it. He dealt in creation, not destruction. This fundamental aspect of his character makes his subsequent actions not a transformation into a mindless killer, but the ultimate desperate act of protection. The kitchen was his trench, the well-being of his comrades his mission. When the enemy threatened to overrun that trench and slaughter those comrades, his defensive instinct would translate into something extraordinary. He was not seeking glory, he was defending his flock with the only tools at his disposal: courage, wit, and a shocking dose of theatrical audacity. 3. The Crucible, summer 1941, the Nazi juggernaut. To understand the magnitude of Ivan's act, one must feel the sheer desperate terror of the summer of 1941 for the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion launched on June 22, was a cataclysm. The German blitzkrieg, perfected in Western Europe, rolled east with devastating efficiency. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground. Panzer divisions in vast pincer movements encircled entire Soviet armies, leading to captures of hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The Red Army, crippled by Stalin's purges of its officer corps and caught by strategic surprise, was reeling, disorganized, and in a chaotic retreat. Morale was fracturing. Stories of German technological and tactical superiority spread like wildfire. The Panzer tank in particular became a symbol of seemingly invincible menace, a steel monster that could crush infantry positions, shrug off small arms fire, and bring instant annihilating firepower for the average Soviet soldier, often under-equipped and thrown into the breach with minimal training. The sight of those gray holes emerging from the dust could trigger panic. The order was stand and fight. But the reality was often